Welcome to the Cultural Human Resources Council Respectful Workplaces in the Arts training video on workplace harassment. This approximate 30-minute training video has been produced as a resource for cultural workers to become familiar with their obligations with respect to workplace harassment and workplace sexual harassment. In this video, the term cultural workers includes individuals who may be referred to as employees, self-employed artists, contractors, and volunteers. The term employer includes not-for-profit boards and arts organizations. The objective of the video is to identify situations cultural workers may encounter and to equip them with practical takeaways and best practices to navigate incidents of harassment. It will also familiarize cultural workers with their rights to bring complaints forward, whether to their employer or to their union. For a resource setting out the legislative obligations cultural workers and employers may have with respect to workplace harassment, we invite you to also view the Cultural Human Resources Council Respectful Workplaces in the Arts webcast on harassment for your home province. This is available, along with other resources, at respectfulartsworkplaces.ca. This video will present 4 scenarios dealing with different situations in which workplace harassment and workplace sexual harassment may occur. Each scenario has been designed to focus on 3 distinct issues that trigger harassment-related rights and obligations. After each scenario, we will identify the key issues the scenario deals with, explore where cultural workers typically do not assert their rights for protection against misconduct, and recommend best practices for addressing each type of situation. To minimize repetition, the scenarios will each focus on the specific issues, challenges, and the key takeaways that they have been created to highlight and reinforce. Recognizing that there will be some overlap among the scenarios, at the end of the video, we will provide general considerations for cultural workers along with a questionnaire to reinforce the intended takeaways.
Selena, the lead actress in a new production, has asked to meet with Gina, the creative director. Selena describes how Brad, the lead actor in the production, has been making her feel uncomfortable when they perform a particular scene that requires the actors to embrace, because he always trails his hand from her shoulder, down her back, and lingers on her butt. Selena has told Brad, in front of Jim, the stage manager, that there's no reason for Brad to be doing that, as it's not in the script and it makes her uncomfortable. Brad's response is that he gets wrapped up in the heat of the moment, and it's his creative liberty to feel and act passionately during the scene. Selena tells Gina she dreads having to rehearse the scene as she feels Brad is crossing the line, and his behavior makes her feel vulnerable. Selena asks Gina not to tell Brad, who is very prominent in the industry, that she has complained.
This scenario illustrates a situation that could lead to a sexual harassment allegation made by Selena against Brad. The key issues in this scenario include work that involves touch or contact, bystander observation of an incident, and expecting a complaint will be kept confidential. Common pitfalls: work that involves touch or contact. Certain types of work, such as intimate acting scenes, dance, and stunt work, can create situations that are susceptible to complaints that an individual has violated appropriate and required boundaries. Cultural workers may experience that employers have mishandled these situations by failing to set expectations from the outset through communication of work or performance expectations. This could be in writing through contracts, policies, or codes of conduct, or through assistance of external expertise such as intimacy coordinators. Or that some cultural workers have failed to adhere to these expectations where they have been properly established. Failure by employers to set expectations or by cultural workers to adhere to them can lead to situations such as the one in this scenario, where Brad is going beyond what is required of the scene and expected by his co-actor, Selena. Bystander observation of an incident. Situations similar to Scenario 1 are commonly not addressed appropriately because cultural workers have not been informed or do not follow the expectation that observers should report incidents that could involve harassment. Bystanders often don't want to be labeled as snitches or don't want to experience retaliation for reporting an observed incident. In this scenario, Jim, the stage manager, has likely observed Brad's conduct when the scene was rehearsed and performed, and certainly observed the complaint raised by Selena directly to Brad. However, Jim does nothing to escalate or assist with resolving Selena's concerns. Expecting a complaint will be kept confidential. Given that victims of harassment are often fearful of retaliation or of losing future opportunities, it's not uncommon for complainants, like Selena, to request that their concerns are not escalated or brought to the attention of the alleged harasser. This is particularly the case where the perpetrator is considered to have authority or influence, similar to Brad, who is prominent in the industry. However, by asking Gina to keep the complaint confidential, Selena is asking Gina to create potential liability for the employer, as it could fail to meet its legal obligation to respond to the situation, which could include an obligation to investigate. Similarly, cultural workers may have the obligation to report issues either under provincial laws or workplace policies, even if they would rather not share them. In this case, Selena may have an obligation to report the incident and to participate in any investigation that the employer may need to conduct. Strategies and best practices. To address issues identified in Scenario 1, cultural workers should consider the following strategies and best practices. Be familiar with and adhere to boundaries and expectations of work, projects, and engagements. Review and abide by conduct expectations communicated in contracts, codes of conduct, policies, and performance discussions, such as table reads or facilitation by intimacy coordinators. Cultural workers should also familiarize themselves with external policies, conduct protocols, and performance guidelines that may exist, such as those established by unions, guilds, and associations. These tools can help cultural workers understand what sort of behavior should be reported and, conversely, what aspects of their own behavior may be inappropriate or offensive to others. As a bystander, report observed incidents that could involve harassment or sexual harassment. Familiarize yourself with methods your employer may have implemented to facilitate bystander reporting, such as direct communication using written forms, electronic means, or hotlines. Be familiar with guidelines regarding the details that bystanders should report, that is, the who, what, where, and when related to an incident, and, irrespective of guidelines, be prepared to report factually to ensure employers can fully and appropriately respond to incidents. Also, understand that bystanders may have obligations to reduce workplace harassment risks from a health and safety perspective, meaning they cannot observe incidents of potential harassment and simply ignore them. Understand that complaints and incidents of harassment cannot be maintained in confidence in any circumstance. Just as cultural workers may be obligated to report incidents and complaints of potential harassment, employers have obligations to reduce harassment risks and may have the obligation to investigate. Cultural workers should understand that supervisors receiving complaints cannot fail to address them, because doing so would violate their obligation to protect the cultural worker. Cultural workers in supervisory roles should be aware that the liabilities associated with failing to appropriately address an incident or complaint of harassment do not rest only with the employer. Supervisors themselves may be liable for fines or other legal penalties for failing to fulfill their obligations to protect cultural workers.
After wrapping up recording a music video for her latest single, Stella, a popular solo artist notorious for her diva behavior, joins the dancers and crew, who the director, Kelly, has taken out for drinks at a bar to celebrate. When entering the bar, Stella stumbles and runs into one of the dancers, Juan. Even though the stumble was not Juan's fault, Stella yells and swears at him. "Go back to where you came from." Later, Juan is sitting at a table with Kelly, and they are scrolling through some photos of the video shoot that have been posted on social media. Juan notices a picture that includes him, which Stella has just commented on, saying, "This guy is useless. He should be sent back to where he came from." Juan shows Kelly the post, who tells Juan, "Drink up and forget about it. We're here to have fun. We should be celebrating."
This scenario illustrates a situation that could lead to a harassment allegation made by Juan. Juan could specifically claim that Stella's behavior constitutes discriminatory harassment, including based on his race, ethnicity, or place of origin, and bullying, including cyberbullying. Scenario 2 involves the following issues: tolerance of regular misconduct by prominent individuals, what constitutes the workplace, and social media misconduct. Common pitfalls. Tolerance of regular misconduct by prominent individuals. It's not uncommon for individuals like Stella to become well known for routinely mistreating others based on their self-perception of prestige within the industry. It's also not uncommon for cultural workers to feel that they cannot speak up when this conduct manifests in ways that could fall within the definitions of harassment or bullying. Leaders and cultural workers may tolerate or enable this behavior so that it becomes accepted and expected. Examples could be an overly aggressive agent, a diva performer like Stella, an unreasonably demanding choreographer, or a threatening donor attempting to leverage its financial influence over a production. Cultural workers should understand that there are legal protections against retaliation for asserting their right to a harassment-free environment. What constitutes the workplace? Cultural workers may also not assert their rights because they fail to recognize that the setting where the offensive misconduct occurs is the workplace, which means that protections against workplace harassment apply. Because the wrap party was organized at the bar by Kelly, the wrap party would be considered an employer-sponsored event, and any harassing behavior that occurs at that location could constitute workplace harassment, even if they are there to have fun. As a result, Juan could file a workplace harassment complaint about Stella's behavior. Social media misconduct. Cultural workers may believe that an employer cannot address conduct that has been experienced or perpetrated on social media. This is not the case. In scenario 2, Stella's social media post constitutes cyberbullying and triggers the employer's obligation to provide protections against and respond appropriately to this type of misconduct. Even if harassing behavior takes place outside of the workplace, cultural workers should be aware that off-duty conduct can also have negative employment consequences in certain circumstances, and reporting harassing behavior by workers to the employer is key. Employers may be able to hold cultural workers responsible for inappropriate off-duty conduct that hurts or has the potential to hurt the employer's reputation, such as Stella's discriminatory comments regarding Juan, which the organization will not want to be associated with because of reputational concerns. Strategies and best practices. To address the potential issues and liabilities identified in Scenario 2, cultural workers should consider the following strategies and best practices. Similar to the strategies identified in Scenario 1, be familiar with and abide by conduct expectations, including not condoning behaviors that could constitute harassment against others or expecting that type of conduct to be condoned. There may be the temptation to condone the misconduct of someone who is prominent or popular in the industry and dismiss it as That's just how they are. This may be due to the fear that the individual will lash out against those who complain, cause reputational harm, or block opportunities. The cultural worker may also not report this misconduct because of the concern that the employer will not take adequate steps to address the misconduct. Recall that cultural workers have obligations to protect themselves and each other against workplace harassment, and on this basis, offensive misconduct cannot be tolerated silently. Further, cultural workers who attempt to assert their rights to work in a harassment-free environment are protected by law from retaliation. Cultural workers may also have external resources to draw on for support, such as unions. Consider whether a situation may be occurring in the workplace. A workplace is defined more broadly than cultural workers may expect. A workplace can include a theater, a rehearsal space, an installation venue, a gala, after-work social events involving colleagues, post-performance feedback over drinks at a bar, and so on. Even if harassing behavior takes place outside of the workplace, cultural workers may be held responsible for inappropriate off-duty conduct that harms or has the potential to harm the employer's reputation. Do not consider social media, and specifically cyberbullying, to be beyond the scope of workplace harassment. Cyberbullying on social media can constitute workplace harassment even if the comment is not posted from the workplace. Cyberbullying outside of working hours can constitute workplace harassment that should be addressed by the organization, meaning that cultural workers should report conduct that negatively affects them and that perpetrators should experience consequences for such misconduct.
Claude is an assistant curator at a gallery, overseeing the installation of paintings for a show that is set to open the next day. The installation contractor, Xavier, is known to be the best in the business, and the gallery often uses him, especially on complicated or time-sensitive installations. While he is setting up the lighting, Xavier starts complaining to Marie, the curator, about the installation plan. Claude overhears Xavier and walks over to explain the vision for the show. Xavier responds by calling the installation plan weak and states that Claude must be gay. Marie is standing nearby and hears their conversation, but does not intervene because of the pressure to make sure the show is ready to open the next day.
Scenario 3 illustrates a situation that could result in Claude complaining of harassment, including discriminatory harassment by Xavier. The key issues in this scenario include misconduct by third-party contractors, condonation of misconduct by the employer, and incidents which occur under performance or deadline pressures. Common pitfalls. Misconduct by third-party contractors. Cultural workers may be aware that employers have obligations to protect their cultural workers against harassment. However, cultural workers may not realize that discriminatory harassment, meaning harassment that can be connected to protected grounds under human rights legislation, can be committed by third parties. It does not have to involve individuals employed by the same employer. In this scenario, Xavier, the third-party contractor, has engaged in discriminatory treatment of Claude, including by criticizing the installation plan on the basis that it is weak and Claude must be gay. In certain circumstances, employers can be liable for violations of human rights legislation by non-cultural workers, such as contractors, where discrimination, including discriminatory harassment, has sufficient connection to the employment context. Further, employers' responsibilities to protect the safety of their workers extends to protecting them from individuals who are not workers, such as contractors, patrons, donors, and other non-cultural workers. Condonation of misconduct by the employer. In this scenario, Marie has a direct obligation to address the contractor's misconduct against Claude, who reports to her. Marie should take steps to address the misconduct, even if Claude does not specifically request it. As a cultural worker, Claude has an obligation to protect himself and others against workplace harassment, and on this basis, offensive misconduct should not be tolerated silently, meaning that Claude should raise his concerns related to Xavier's inappropriate comments. Incidents which occur under performance or deadline pressures. Time pressures to get the job done quickly, or where it's felt that the show must go on, can lead employers and cultural workers to mishandle complaints or incidents of harassment. In this scenario, the pressure on Marie to ensure the show is ready to open the next day likely motivates her to ignore the contractor's behavior towards Claude. Similarly, Claude may be inclined to ignore Xavier's misconduct towards him because he is committed to the show opening on schedule and to the installation being completed by the most skilled person available, Xavier. Strategies and best practices. To address the potential issues and liabilities identified in Scenario 3, cultural workers should consider the following strategies and best practices. Understand that conduct expectations may apply to everyone at all times, including third parties like contractors. Employers' responsibility to protect the safety of their workers extends to protecting them from individuals who are not workers, such as contractors, patrons, and other non-cultural workers. Conversely, individuals like Xavier, who provide services as contractors, should be aware that they do not have carte blanche to behave badly towards cultural workers of the organization to which they are providing services. Even though they are not cultural workers of an organization, contractors should be familiar with the conduct expectations of the workplace in which they are providing services. Do not condone misconduct perpetrated by contractors or tolerate it silently. When it occurs, it should be addressed. If the cultural worker being targeted by the inappropriate behavior is comfortable doing so, they should communicate to the perpetrator that it is unacceptable. The cultural worker should raise the issue with the employer and/or with his or her union if applicable, and should be aware of the legal protections for cultural workers against retaliation for asserting their right to a harassment-free environment. Cultural workers should take all possible measures to protect themselves from ongoing harassment risks. Where job time pressures exist, or where misconduct occurs during performances, any concerns that exist should be expressed. Cultural workers should understand that employers are obligated to take measures to minimize the impact of the conduct and will be required to make full response to the incident when feasible, including by investigating as may be required. For example, in the scenario we just explored, if the cultural worker raises concerns, the curator could separate the contractor and assistant curator and then address the issue thoroughly at the first opportunity.
Jeffrey, a literary agent, is working on some final details, organizing tomorrow's lecture and book signing for his most prominent client, Michael. As Jeffrey is working, Michael calls him and says he wants to discuss the logistics for the book signing the next day. He asks Jeffrey to meet him at his hotel suite. Jeffrey goes to Michael's suite. Michael opens the door, wearing only a robe. Michael offers Jeffrey a drink. Jeffrey accepts the drink and sits on the sofa. Jeffrey asks Michael what he wants to discuss about the book signing. Michael sits beside Jeffrey and begins complimenting his looks and making suggestive comments. Jeffrey is uncomfortable, but doesn't feel that he can leave.
This scenario illustrates a situation that could result in Jeffrey claiming that he has been sexually harassed by Michael. The key issues in this scenario include abuse of power, reluctant reporting, and what constitutes the workplace. Common pitfalls. Abuse of power. While Michael is Jeffrey's client, given that Michael is likely aware he is Jeffrey's most prominent client, Michael may perceive that he has power over Jeffrey in the situation. In a situation such as this, the culture worker may be reluctant to report an incident because of the power imbalance. Unfortunately, certain people who may feel they wield power and/or influence over others may exploit others by abusing their power or authority over them, sometimes promising or implying a benefit or advantage will be extended in exchange for their acceptance of the misconduct. Individuals starting their careers or who are avidly seeking opportunities to fulfill their dreams may be vulnerable to this abuse of power type of misconduct. Reluctant reporting. Like Jeffrey, the victim of any unwelcome conduct may be reluctant to complain or assert their rights, even where conduct expectations may exist or where there are requirements to have others present, for example, an equity representative, in situations that make them vulnerable to being mistreated or harassed by someone in a position of authority or influence. What constitutes the workplace? Again, like in scenario 2, cultural workers may fail to recognize that, given the requirements of Jeffrey's role, Michael's hotel suite could be considered a workplace, which could result in the employer's obligation to take or enforce proper steps to ensure Jeffrey's safety. Jeffrey could also be required to take reasonable precautions for his own safety. Strategies and best practices. To address the potential issues and liabilities identified in Scenario 4, cultural workers should consider the following strategies and best practices. Cultural workers should come forward with concerns because they have the responsibility to act in the best interest of their own safety and that of others. Acting in the best interest of their own safety may mean cultural workers should take measures to avoid higher risk circumstances where possible, such as the situation Jeffrey is in when he agrees to visit Michael in his suite rather than suggesting they meet in a public area of the hotel. Cultural workers can assert their rights under applicable legislation that prohibits harassment by removing themselves from situations that may be susceptible to harassment. Again, cultural workers should be aware that reprisals are prohibited under these types of legislation. A reprisal exists where an employer or supervisor imposes or threatens to impose any penalty, intimidates, or coerces a cultural worker because the cultural worker has made a complaint of workplace harassment. This protection may be important if Jeffrey's employer punishes Jeffrey for making allegations against Michael, and is also key in a situation where the alleged harasser is not a client, as in this scenario, but is a supervisor who may be facing allegations of inappropriate behavior. Cultural workers should understand how and to whom to report issues. Cultural workers should also be aware that they may be required by law or policy to report situations that could constitute workplace harassment, even if they may rather choose not to do so. Cultural workers should also seek support from a union or guild they may belong to, where appropriate. As in Scenario 2, cultural workers should consider whether a situation may be occurring in the workplace. Given that Jeffrey agrees to meet Michael at the hotel for work-related reasons, the inappropriate conduct is likely occurring in a location that could constitute the workplace, and therefore the conduct is within the employer's responsibility to address. As such, Jeffrey should ensure that his employer is aware of what happened. Workplace harassment has become increasingly challenging for cultural workers and employers to navigate. Public awareness of high-profile cases, Me Too and Time's Up movement activity, enhanced legislative protections, and expanded employee entitlements have emboldened those experiencing and observing this type of workplace misconduct to bring incidents and complaints forward, and have prompted employers to rely on cultural workers' own obligations to contribute to the goal of preventing workplace harassment. Given the changes in the legal and social climates and the rise in workplace complaints and incidents, it is crucial for cultural workers and employers for whom they work, provide services, or volunteer their time to understand how to proactively contain this type of misconduct and to ensure they are aware of their obligations. Cultural workers should also strive to achieve more than mere baseline compliance when it comes to their workplace harassment obligations. Working with their employer to ensure safe workplaces boosts productivity and quality of projects, performances, and productions, which benefit employers and cultural workers alike. Thank you for viewing this Respectful Workplaces in the Arts training video on workplace harassment. Please note that the content is not intended to be legal advice. Should you face situations similar to the ones discussed, you should assess them on a case-by-case basis and seek advice and representation as necessary. To maximize your familiarity with the content and key takeaways, please take a few moments to participate in the quiz that will conclude this session. For further information on the topics discussed during this training video, please visit respectfulartsworkplaces.ca.